ആവേശകരമാക്കി തീർക്കുന്നതിന് വേണ്ടി ഇവിടെ എത്തിച്ചേർന്ന എല്ലാ സഖാക്കളെയും സുഹൃത്തുക്കളെയും ഈ ചടങ്ങിലേക്ക് സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്തുകൊണ്ട് അധ്യക്ഷത വഹിക്കാൻ വേണ്ടി സഖാവ് കെ രാമചന്ദ്രൻ MLA ക്ഷണിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് എൻ്റെ വാക്കുകൾ നിർത്തുന്നു. നമസ്കാരം.
അധ്യക്ഷ സ്ഥാനത്തേക്ക് കെ രാമചന്ദ്രൻ MLA ഏറെ സ്നേഹത്തോടെ സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യുന്നു.
വേദിയിലും സദസ്സിലുമുള്ള നേതാക്കളെ, സഖാക്കളെ, സുഹൃത്തുക്കളെ, നമ്മളിന്ന് മഹാനായ കമ്മ്യൂണിസ്റ്റ് സഖാവ് EMSൻ്റെ ജന്മദിനത്തോടനുബന്ധിച്ചുള്ള ദേശീയ സെമിനാർ ഇന്നും നാളെയുമായി ഏറ്റവും നല്ല നിലയിൽ ഇവിടെ സംഘടിപ്പിക്കപ്പെട്ടിരിക്കുകയാണ്. 8 സെഷനിലായിട്ട്, സമാപന സെഷൻ ഉൾപ്പെടെ 8 സെഷനിലായിട്ട് വിവിധ വിഷയങ്ങൾ, ഏറ്റവും പ്രസക്തമായ വിഷയങ്ങൾ എടുത്ത് വലിയൊരു സംവാദം സംഘടിപ്പിച്ചിരിക്കുന്നു. ഉദ്ഘാടന സെഷൻ ഇവിടെ കഴിഞ്ഞു. രണ്ടാമത്തെ സെഷൻ എന്ന നിലയിൽ നമ്മളിപ്പോൾ പ്രവേശിക്കുമ്പോൾ നമ്മളിപ്പോൾ ഒരു 35-40 മിനിറ്റോളം വൈകിട്ടാണ് നമ്മളത് ആരംഭിക്കുന്നത്. ആദ്യമായി മഹാനായ കമ്മ്യൂണിസ്റ്റ് സഖാവ് EMSൻ്റെ ദീപ്തമായ സ്മരണയ്ക്ക് മുമ്പിൽ രക്താഭിവാദ്യങ്ങൾ അർപ്പിക്കുന്നു. ഇവിടെ ഇന്നത്തെ വിഷയം, ഇപ്പോൾ ഇവിടെ അവതരിപ്പിക്കപ്പെടുന്ന വിഷയം മതദേശീയതയുടെ രാഷ്ട്രീയം എന്ന വിഷയമാണ് ഇപ്പോൾ ഇവിടെ അവതരിപ്പിക്കപ്പെടുന്നത്. നമുക്കെല്ലാം സുപരിചിതനും ബഹുമാനപ്പെട്ട പ്രൊഫസർ പ്രഭാത് പട്നായിക്കാണ് വിഷയം അവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്നത്. മറ്റ് കാര്യങ്ങളിലേക്കൊന്നും കടക്കാതെ നേരെ നമ്മളുടെ വിഷയാവതരണത്തിലേക്ക് കടക്കണം എന്നാണ് ഉദ്ദേശിക്കുന്നത്. പ്രൊഫസർ പ്രഭാത് പട്നായിക്കിനെ വിഷയം അവതരിപ്പിച്ച് സംസാരിക്കുന്നതിന് വേണ്ടി വളരെ സ്നേഹപൂർവ്വം ക്ഷണിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് എല്ലാവർക്കും എൻ്റെ സ്നേഹാഭിവാദ്യങ്ങൾ. നന്ദി.
We now move to our core academic session. It's our great privilege to welcome one of India's foremost political, economic and Marxist thinkers, Professor Prabhat Patnaik. Let us warmly welcome Professor Prabhat Patnaik to the podium for his insightful address on politics of religious nationalism.
Comrades and friends, I'm very grateful for this opportunity which is given to me to speak at this session. Unfortunately, I have a bit of a problem with my back, so I cannot stand for a great length of time, which is why I'm sitting and speaking. The topic on which I'm supposed to speak is the politics of religious nationalism. In a multi-religious third world society, the idea of religious nationalism, which is being promoted by the Hindutva elements in India, is a contradiction in terms. One cannot have a religious nationalism the way the RSS is propagating. Why not? Because the concept of a nation, the concept of nationalism, they are modern concepts. The nation is formed in a third world multi-religious society in the process of struggle against imperialism. Why is imperialism so different? Imperialism is fundamentally different from every previous ruling class. Why is imperialism so different? It's different for at least 2 very obvious reasons. The first reason is that all earlier rulers, whether they were Hindu, whether they were Muslims, whether they were Mughals, whether they were Marathas, they took away the surplus from the people, again irrespective of religion of the people, and they used this surplus for all kinds of purposes, for building, for maintaining an army, and so on, all of which generated employment domestically. With imperialism, for the first time, you have the surplus being taken out of the country. It does not generate any domestic employment. On the contrary, the domestic employment that earlier had been sustained by this surplus now becomes unemployed. The second reason why imperialism is different from every previous mode of, every previous experience of ruling in this country is that for the first time you have the coming into the country without any restrictions of goods which in fact displace domestic production. Again, this is something which generates unemployment. So unemployment is generated because of the import of machine-made goods, which are cheaper, but against which there is no protection for the domestic producers. And unemployment is generated because of the siphoning off of the surplus of the country, not all of it, but a substantial part of the surplus of the country abroad, which basically means that what was available domestically to sustain a whole range of activities is no longer available, and that in turn generates unemployment. Therefore, the origins of all the problems that we face today, whether it is a problem of poverty, whether it is a problem of unemployment, and of course the entire colonial period was marked by the recurrence of famines. The British control over Bengal began with the Battle of Plassey in 1757. In 1765, the British acquired the Diwani of Bengal, which means the revenue collecting rights over Bengal, which they had won in Plassey, from the Mughal emperor. And immediately they jacked up the revenue so much that by 1770 there was a famine in which 1/3 of Bengal's population simply died. Bengal had a population that time, obviously when I say Bengal, I mean United Bengal, had a population that time of 30 million. 10 million people died in a famine in 1770, and of course this is something which, even though the company's employees that time recorded, is something that does not get into modern economic history. 10 million people died in a famine. So imperialism began in India with 10 million people dying in 1770. Imperialism ended in India again with the Great Bengal Famine of 1943, in which about 4 million people died. Therefore, imperialism was associated with something altogether different. Nothing like this had happened in India before. Of course, rulers were oppressive. Of course, the Mughal rulers took away a lot of the surplus. So did the Marathas. As a matter of fact, there is a well-known play by Utpal Datta called Borgi Elodeshe. Borgi is the way that Bengalis refer to the Maratha invaders. And they created havoc in the country. So earlier invasions had been and earlier rulers had been oppressive, had been ruthless. But on the other hand, they spent whatever they collected from the people inside the country, because of which they also generated employment. That is something which the Mughals, which the British did not do, and that was the beginning of underdevelopment as we know it today. Therefore, to talk of a nationalism that is religious is basically to bypass, to completely forget, to distract attention from the specific nature of imperialism which continues to this day. And therefore, whenever someone talks about religious nationalism, as indeed the Hindutva elements do, they are doing a whitewashing job as far as imperialism is concerned. But the question arises, how come that suddenly this has become so important that now, how come that these Hindutva forces have become so important? When you look at it, and there's a lot of discussion that is taking place in various newspapers and magazines and so much, and about why Hindutva forces have become so important. What is missed in all these discussions is that such forces are not confined to India alone. These forces are a global phenomenon. You have all over the world similar forces coming up. Milei in Argentina, President Milei of Argentina, Meloni in Italy, Orban in Hungary, who lost the elections recently, Trump in the United States. Netanyahu, of course, combines the viciousness of settler colonialism together with these particular features that I would be discussing. Modi in India, Erdogan in Turkey, all over the world. AfD in Germany, which is a new kind of element. You have Marine Le Pen in France. There are these kinds of forces which actually are coming up all over the world. Extreme right-wing forces. Now they have at least 6 common characteristics which they share to varying degrees. The first, of course, is that all of them generate hatred against a hapless minority. In India, it is the Muslims or the Christians. It's a religious hatred against a religious minority. Elsewhere, it could be the Chinese. Somewhere else, it could be the immigrants. Somewhere else, it could be an ethnic minority. All of them generate hatred against a minority. And what is called religious nationalism is nothing else but the generation of hatred against the minority. The second feature is, of course, an extremely oppressive state. Obviously, that is characteristic of all these regimes. We know the characteristics in India. Extreme oppressive state, which is used against the left, against artists, against intellectuals, against, kind of the opposition, against political forces that are opposed to the hegemony of these particular elements which come up when they capture power. The third thing is that they combine the use of state repression together with the use of their own thugs. Now, this is something which Mussolini had shown in Italy. You had the group called Balailas, which were the young fascists who actually went around terrorizing the opposition, quite apart from the terror struck by the state organs. Now, exactly similarly, you actually have the young fascist thugs in India who go around creating terror among the masses, among the people, quite apart from what the enforcement directorate can do, quite apart from what the CBI and so on can do. So the use of state terror together with the terror of your own thugs is something which is a very specific feature of all these governments. I should add that the Balailas were studied by a great RSS major figure called Dr. Mungi, who had gone to Italy specifically to study how Mussolini's fascism worked and came back so inspired by the Balailas that he actually decided to set up the ABVP in India in imitation of Mussolini's Balailas. The fourth feature, which is very important, is the strong relationship between these elements, these so-called nationalist elements on the one hand, and monopoly capital on the other. This is absolutely clear. You may have seen Visconti's film *The Damned*, which actually discusses a very close relationship between the Nazis of Germany on the one hand and various monopoly houses on the other. The fourth feature, or maybe the fifth feature, is that among the monopoly capital, you actually have a new group of monopoly capital that is particularly close to these new so-called nationalists, which I would call fascist groups, that actually come up. In Germany, the very well-known anarcho-Marxist Daniel Gérin had written a book called Fascism and Big Business, in which he showed how the old monopoly houses that were concentrating on things like textiles and so on were really, of course they all went with the fascists, were not as important in the new dispensation as the new monopoly houses, which had to do with producer goods, which had to do with iron and steel, which had to do with armaments production and so on. So and similarly in Japan, you had the old Zaibatsu, the old monopoly houses, but you had a new group called the Shinko Zaibatsu, which again was much more concentrated in armaments production, producer goods and so on, which was particularly close to the Japanese military fascists. So a new group is something which is particularly new group of monopoly capital, particularly close to these forces that are coming up. Lastly, you actually have the cult of the leader. You have an inversion where instead of the nation producing the leader, it is the leader who defines the nation. If you are against the leader, you are anti-national. As opposed to Mahatma Gandhi's definition of the nation as something whose role is to wipe away the tears from the eyes of the people, you have the opposite, namely the people are there in order to adulate the leader who symbolizes the nation. As a matter of fact, what Comrade Baby and Comrade Vishwam and so on were talking about is really an extension of this, because when you talk about, if the people do not adulate the leader, if the people might vote against the leader, then you should get rid of the people. And that is exactly what all this SIR and so on are trying to do, that disenfranchise those who are really likely to vote against the people. In fact, Bertolt Brecht had once written a poem saying that the government, it appears, has lost the confidence of the people. Why doesn't it dismiss the people and elect another? That is exactly what all these exercises currently going on in India are trying to do. So you have a complete inversion of the notion of the nation and the people. So associated with this, of course, are many other features, and these features themselves are not necessarily uniformly developed everywhere. India happens to be one country in which they are particularly marked. And all these features I'm talking about, characterizing the new kind of political regimes coming up, are all to be found in India. They have something in common. They have extreme commonality with the fascists of the 1930s, as the examples I've been giving would clarify. Therefore, I would call them neo-fascists. Why do I call them neo-fascists as opposed to straightforward fascists? I'll explain that in a moment. Fascist elements are there in every modern society. But these fascist elements are typically in the fringes of society. They come center stage only when they have the backing of monopoly capital, and particularly, as I said, backing of a new element of monopoly capital. Backing in terms of money, You know, the BJP now claims to be the richest party in the world, and backing in terms of media support, because monopoly capital controls the media, and therefore they get the backing of monopoly capital, and thereby they get the backing of the monopoly controlled media. So these fascist elements, who are normally in the fringes of society, come center stage. They are pushed center stage when they come to when they are helped, promoted by monopoly capital. And why are they promoted by monopoly capital? Because certain conjunctures arise when monopoly capital feels that its hegemony in society is threatened. To buttress its hegemony, therefore, it promotes these fascist elements. It feels its hegemony threatened whenever there is an economic crisis. The crisis of the 1930s, the Great Depression, is what produced fascism in Europe and Japan and so on, because of the fact that that is when, obviously, there was huge unemployment. The legitimacy of monopoly capital got questioned, and that is why they needed a distractive discourse in order to divide the people, in order to focus attention on all kinds of other things to buttress the hegemony of monopoly capital. Today, you don't, of course, have a depression of that kind, but what you do have is that neoliberal capitalism has come to a dead end. Why has it come to a dead end? Neoliberal capitalism has generated massive inequality. It has generated massive inequality all over the world. In the advanced capitalist countries, wages of workers do not rise, because if they go on strike demanding higher wages, capital says, oh, we are going to relocate our plant in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Bangladesh, in India, in Vietnam, or whatever. So the threat of relocation weakens the trade union struggles in the advanced capitalist countries. Joseph Stiglitz made a calculation. He's a well-known American economist. He got a Nobel Prize as well. He made a calculation according to which the average real wage of a male American worker in 2011 was marginally lower than in 1968. And this is in the United States. So the real wages in the advanced countries don't rise because of the threat of relocation. But all this relocation does not mean that the real wages rise in the places to which such industry is being relocated, such activity is being relocated. Why not? Because of the fact that here the wages were low because of the mass unemployment generated in colonial times. But on the other hand, despite all relocation, there is no dent that is made in this unemployment. Unemployment continues. The labor reserves continue to be as large, if not larger than before. Why is that? Because firstly, you have, because of competition between the different countries, in a situation where, of course, export-led growth is the general cry, which is neoliberal capitalism promotes export-led growth. In such a case, every country feels compelled to introduce technological change that changes the processes, products, and so on. What is called process and product innovations, their pace becomes quickened. And when it gets quickened, obviously these innovations are all labor productivity augmenting. Therefore, the rate of growth of labor productivity increases greatly. Even when, therefore, the GDP growth rate rises, which many people argue, though this is a very dicey proposition, that in India under neoliberalism the growth rate has been higher. Even if it is higher, the rate of growth of labor productivity is so much higher that the employment growth rate, which is the difference between the two, is lower today than it was in the days before the neoliberal regime came into being. And if employment growth rate is lower, sometimes people refer to it as jobless growth. We have growth but no jobs. If the employment growth rate is lower than the rate of growth of the workforce, then you find that the reserve army of labor, the labor reserves, as a proportion of the labor force, tend to rise rather than diminish. And if the labor reserves rise, then the real wages remain stuck at the same level where they were before, a kind of subsistence level. And what is more, per capita income of the labor force declines, because while real wages remain the same, you find that fewer people have got proper jobs. So you find that both in the global north and in the global south, there is a situation where the working people generally are not experiencing any increase in their real living standards. But then we know GDP is growing, labor productivity is growing. That means the surplus is growing. The share of surplus in world output is much higher. One implication of it, of course, is what Piketty and others are talking about, namely that there is an extreme increase in inequality. Piketty's figures show that in India today, the top 1% of the population has a share of the national income which is higher than at any time in the last 100 years. Now you can imagine, last 100 years we had Maharajas and so on. Even so, the share of the top 1% of the population is higher, in national income, is higher than at any time in the last 100 years. So one implication of the rise in the share of surplus is that you have a massive increase in inequality, which everybody knows, everybody is talking about. The other implication is that when there's a rise in inequality, in effect, when there is a shift of income distribution from the working people to those who live off the surplus, there is a reduction in consumption demand. Why? Because if you give a rupee to a worker, the worker would more or less spend that entire rupee buying food and various other things. If you give a rupee to a rich man, the rich man might spend 50 paise out of it, put the other 50 paise in his pocket saying, I'll spend it day after tomorrow. The spending day after tomorrow is what economists call saving. Therefore, the savings ratio goes up as a proportion of income when you have a redistribution of income from the poor to the rich. Looking at it the other way around, the consumption ratio goes down. And of course, if there is reduced consumption demand, then there is reduced aggregate demand. Therefore, there is what Marx would have called a crisis of overproduction. That whatever is produced is not being demanded. Now, this is something which is happening all over the world, and this is what characterizes the contemporary world capitalism, neoliberal capitalism. And when this happens, then of course, production is cut back, unemployment rises, and so on. And therefore, you have a general increase in unemployment. Now, this is the kind of situation that had given rise to fascism in the 1930s, because this is what undermines the hegemony of monopoly capital, undermines the legitimacy of its saying that, look, what a beautiful society we have created. In India, for a very long time, it was claimed that you actually had a very beautiful society being created because of neoliberal capitalism. But of course, the slowing down of the growth rate, the enmeshing of neoliberal capitalism in stagnation and higher unemployment, which is what you find particularly after 2008, which is where the financial crisis really revealed all this. You actually find that there is now a situation of challenge to the hegemony of monopoly capital. When that situation arises, monopoly capital then takes the help of fascist, neo-fascist elements. You may recollect that the whole idea of making Narendra Modi the Prime Minister of the country was mooted at an investor summit which was held in Gujarat when he was the Chief Minister of that particular state. So it is in fact a project of monopoly capital in India to promote Modi, to promote Hindutva and so on, in order to bring about a continuation of the hegemony of monopoly capital. But this is where I come to the crux of the matter, which is why I use the term neo-fascism. You see, in Germany, in Japan was the first country to come out of the Great Depression of the 1930s. It came out of the depression in 1931 because the Japanese military fascist government spent huge amounts of money, which were simply borrowed, which means we basically used a fiscal deficit to spend huge amounts of money on armaments in preparation for the war. And of course, fairly soon, then they started entering China and so on. And thereby, they got rid of the unemployment that had existed. The workers were not particularly better off in terms of the wage rate, but of course, they were better off in terms of the fact that unemployment had got reduced. Similarly, in Germany, when Hitler came to power, he actually engaged in massive fiscal deficit in order to spend on military expenditures, thereby generate employment. So Germany too overcame its unemployment of the Great Depression. In fact, even though wages did not rise, wages in fact marginally fell. But on the other hand, there was a while when the horrors of the war had not struck Germany, but on the other hand, unemployment had disappeared, when the Nazis became even reasonably popular, up to about 1939 certainly. They enjoyed greater popularity because of the fact that they had overcome unemployment. Now, today's fascists, all these people I'm talking about, Modi is a classic example, cannot overcome unemployment. Why not? Because of the fact that suppose you spend 100 rupees, suppose the government spends 100 rupees. If it raises the 100 rupees by simply a fiscal deficit, in other words, it just prints money in order to raise the money for spending, fine, then this would raise the level of demand in the economy because you're not taxing anybody else, and therefore it would increase output. If the government spends these 100 rupees by taxing the rich, who, as I said, spend only a part of it. They may be spending 50 rupees, but keep the other 50 in their pocket. So some of the tax would come out from the 50 in their pocket. Therefore, there'll be some reduction in their demand, there may be, but on the other hand, there'll be some 100 rupee worth of increase. Therefore, there's net increase in aggregate demand. But if you have the government taxing the working people and spending, the working people spend the bulk of their incomes anyway. Their savings are very low. The working people have very small amounts of wealth. That's why they are working people. So if you spend 100 rupees by taxing the working people, you're not increasing demand because their demand would go down by 100 rupees. Government demand goes up by 100 rupees. Net increase is zero. But both these ways of financing government expenditure so that it can add to aggregate demand are opposed by finance capital. In fact, they are opposed by finance capital so much so that in the 1930s, finance capital was basically national finance capital. You talked of German finance capital, French finance capital, British finance capital, and so on. Therefore, the fascists in particular countries could reach some kind of an agreement with their respective finance capitals to allow them to overcome their objections to fiscal deficit, which is how, as I said, they spent huge amounts on through fiscal deficit in order to enlarge military expenditures. But today, finance capital is globalized, is international. Finance capital is not Indian finance capital or German finance capital or British finance capital. It is globalized. It is moving around all over the world. If finance capital is globalized, but the state remains a nation state, even a fascist nation state cannot overcome the objections of finance either to a fiscal deficit or taxing the rich. It obviously would not allow taxing the rich because the financiers themselves are among the richest. But on the other hand, it would also not allow fiscal deficits. That is why every country in the world, with the exception of the US, has actually got this fiscal responsibility legislation. Ask yourself the question, why is it that in India we have a fiscal responsibility legislation? We don't have a legislation that says a certain minimum amount has to be spent on healthcare. We don't have a legislation that says a certain minimum amount has to be spent on education. But on the other hand, we do have a legislation saying that the fiscal deficit must not exceed 3% for the central government, 3% for the state government. Why do we have it? Because of the demand of finance capital. Finance capital is not interested in whether you have your children being educated or enjoying healthcare, but it is interested in ensuring that the fiscal deficit does not cross, generally all over the world, 3%. Here we have 3% for state governments, 3% for central government. So, if it is the case that the finance capital wishes become binding on the nation state, because finance capital is globalized, is international finance capital, then it follows that the capacity of the nation state to generate employment dwindles. It cannot generate employment. As a matter of fact, I could give you more examples if time permitted. In Britain, there was a lady called Elizabeth Truss, who became the Prime Minister. Elizabeth Truss had a Chancellor of the Exchequer, Finance Minister, who produced before the British Parliament a plan of what she proposes to do, or her government proposes to do. In fact, that plan had even talked about providing subsidies to the British capitalists. But that plan had talked about an enlargement of the fiscal deficit. So even though it was as pro-capitalist a plan as you can imagine, because of the fact that it was enlarging the fiscal deficit, finance began to flow out of Britain. Therefore, the British pound sterling fell, and therefore Liz Truss had to resign her prime ministership. She became the shortest serving prime minister in the entire history of Britain. So the point is, finance's opposition to fiscal deficits, particularly in a situation where the nation state is a nation state, but finance is globalized, it is international, becomes binding, and because of that, even a neo-fascist nation state cannot overcome the unemployment and stagnation that neoliberal capitalism has brought us to. And that being the case, neoliberal capitalism strikes a deal, or monopoly elements strike a deal with all these fascist groups, neo-fascist groups, in order to buttress the hegemony of monopoly capital. You have a corporate Hindutva alliance. The corporate Hindutva alliance is one in which the Hindutva elements buttress the corporate elements, and the corporate elements finance and give media support and other kinds of support to the Hindutva element. This alliance comes into being, as I said, in a period in which there is the likelihood of a crisis of hegemony as far as monopoly capital is concerned. Now, not only therefore is unemployment going to continue, is going to get aggravated, because as I said, the problems we the problems that the Indian nation state is facing in generating larger employment is also being faced in the United States, is also being faced in the advanced countries. And therefore, what does Trump want to do? Trump wants to create employment in the US not by enlarging government spending, but by exporting unemployment to the global south. The whole idea of these huge tariffs that Trump erected was basically to make sure that global south does not find its market in the United States. Therefore, the market is snatched by American producers. Therefore, unemployment in America declines because there is greater production, while unemployment in those countries from where those goods were coming increases. That is called beggar thy neighbor policy, that I become better off by making my neighbor into a beggar. So Trump is pursuing a beggar thy neighbor policy vis-a-vis the global south. One implication of that, which we can see, is the unequal trade treaty that Trump is imposing on India. It's unequal for two very obvious reasons. Firstly, America would be imposing much higher tariffs on Indian goods than India would be imposing on American goods, or would be allowed to impose on American goods. Unequal. Secondly, even more significant, is that Trump is actually telling India in that treaty that you have to buy over the next 5 years $500 billion of our goods, which means every year you have to buy $100 billion of our goods. How much do we buy from America at the moment? $40 billion annually. That means you increase your purchases of our goods by 2.5 times. This is amazing. This is something which has not even happened in the history of capitalism ever, where a country has actually dictated to another, buy so much of our goods. So anyway, unequal treaties which are now being negotiated, and I don't suppose India is the only country against which Trump would be doing this. There would be other countries too against which Trump would be working such unequal treaties. There are other parts of the American strategy which I don't have to go into. One part, of course, is recolonization of the global south. That basically means take away the raw materials of the global south, which is what they have done in Venezuela, which is what they were trying to do in Iran, and which is what they have talked about Greenland and others. The real decolonization was the economic decolonization, when we acquired control over our own resources. The whole idea now that Trump has is to reverse that recolonization of the global south. But anyway, I don't have time to go into that. So the important thing, however, is that under the impact of this kind of measure, which the US is now imposing on the global south, our crisis is going to become even worse. Our stagnation is going to become even worse. Our unemployment is going to become even worse. And particularly to the extent that the US would be selling food grains, obviously this also has other implications for our food security. Now, if that happens, then if you have the corporate Hindutva alliance that not only cannot overcome the crisis, but actually presides over a worsening of the crisis, in that case, obviously, the othering of the Muslims, the hatred against the Muslims, the only weapon they have is to divide the workers, along religious lines, is to distract the entire discourse by emphasizing things where generally people therefore would not be thinking in terms of the system being anything to be blamed. If that is the case, then this kind of a situation would become even worse. That neo-fascism would become even worse. Consider today, the biggest problem, as is very clear from this cockroach Janata Party and so on, the biggest problem before the youth is unemployment. But what is the government talking about? Bangladeshi immigrants. As if the Bangladeshi immigrants have taken away our jobs. Incredible. I mean, the kind of distraction which is being practiced, the kind of deception, public deception which is being practiced is just incredible. And this is what fascism does, and this is what fascism is doing. It follows, therefore, that if neo-fascism is a product of the crisis of neoliberalism, then overcoming neo-fascism is possible only when you go beyond neoliberalism itself. The crisis of neoliberalism cannot be overcome within neoliberalism itself. Therefore, while for neo-fascism or for fighting neo-fascism, it's very important that we actually come together with many forces, all political forces which uphold democracy, uphold the rule of law and so on. At the same time, we have to make it very clear that unless you strike at the root of neo-fascism, which is of course the neoliberal capitalist economy, in that case these fellows would come back. Look at the way Trump came back. So the point is that the decisive fight against neo-fascism requires the uprooting, going beyond the neoliberal capitalist economy. Now, of course, the moment a government comes that, let us say, has to start with the support of the workers and peasants, it introduces, let's say, a national health service, then you'd find that finance would start flowing out of the country, just as it started flowing out of Britain during Liz Truss's time. And if so, then you'd have to have control on capital flows. And if you have control on capital flows, prevent finance from flowing out, then it would not flow in. If it doesn't flow in, then how do you manage your trade deficit? You'll have to have trade control. So you'd have to have a movement away from neoliberalism into a whole lot of controls. And of course, to talk about controls does not mean that we go back to what we had before neoliberalism, but we have to have a new deal. My last point, which I would like to say, is what would this new deal consist of? Now, this is for people who are politically active to think about, but me as an economist, I feel that the new deal must entail the institution of a set of fundamental constitutionally guaranteed economic rights. Our constitution actually did something which was not quite fair. It gave civil rights, political rights, and so on, but when it came to economic rights, it put them all into the directive principles of state policy, which are not justiciable. Therefore, you can't take the government to court because some principle mentioned in the directive principles has been violated. So I would suggest that we actually institute a set of fundamental economic rights. Now, these rights, we made some calculations. If you just have 5 rights, one is the right to food, which basically means give everybody food exactly on the same terms on which they were getting in the pre-pandemic days. Nowadays, of course, you get this 5 kilo extra of rice, of grains, but that's going to disappear in a little while. So give food to everybody, not just the BPL population, exactly on the same terms as they used to get in the pre-pandemic days. The second, a right to free universal health care, quality health care through a national health service like Britain has, like Soviet Union had, like the Scandinavian countries have. So everybody has completely free health care, not insurance. Everybody has completely free health care. The third is right to free, quality, publicly funded education. The fourth is a right to employment, and failing the provision of employment, the person must be paid a full wage, which accepts the fact that if a person is unemployed, it's not his or her fault. It is the fault of society that cannot find a job for him. And lastly, a right to a living old age pension and disability benefit. You'd be amazed to know that to this day, till this moment, the amount that the central government gives per head for a retired person pension is 200 rupees. A right to a non-contributory, universal, old age living pension and disability benefits. If you added up the total money that would be required for these rights, this would be financed just by imposing two taxes on the top 1% of the population. One is a 2% wealth tax, and the other is a 1/3 inheritance tax. That means if I have 100 rupees of property, when I die, or even if I don't die but I pass it on to my son, the state should take away 1/3 of it. This, by the way, is perfectly compatible with the logic of capitalism, because of the fact that in capitalism it is said that the capitalists have some special quality because of which they get all this money. But in that case, the children of the capitalists must display the same special quality before they are allowed to inherit that money. And obviously, till they have exhibited that special quality, they have no right to that money. Which is why most advanced capitalist countries have very high rates of inheritance taxation. Japan has 55% death duties. That means if I die, leave for my children 100 rupees of property, the state takes away 55 rupees of it. Even the United States and Britain have 40% death duties. In India, zero. In India, zero death duty. In India, zero wealth taxation. In fact, the 2% wealth taxation on the top 1% of the population I'm suggesting is much lower than what either Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, who were contestants for the US presidency along with Joe Biden, had suggested for the US. So that the inequality is so large that you can actually raise the funds required for financing a welfare state quite easily. But the point is, of course, money is not sufficient. You have to have the goods also. It's not enough to have money. You also have to have the food grains production and so on and so forth. But all that has to be done. But fundamentally, I want to argue that it is perfectly possible for us to overcome both the politics, the political kind of incubus of neo-fascism, as well as the economic incubus of neoliberal capitalism, both of which are related, by moving to a welfare state, and certainly that is perfectly possible, provided we can convince the working people of this country of our good intentions. Thank you.
രണ്ടാമത്തെ സെഷൻ സമാപനത്തോടെടുക്കുന്നു. നന്ദി പ്രകടനത്തിനായി CCGEW ജില്ലാ സെക്രട്ടറി സഖാവ് IB ശ്രീകുമാറിനെ സ്നേഹാദരം ക്ഷണിക്കുന്നു.
പ്രിയ സഖാക്കളെ, സുഹൃത്തുക്കളെ, Ems സ്മൃതിയുടെ രണ്ടാം സെഷൻ ഇവിടെ അവസാനിക്കുകയാണ്. മതദേശീയതയുടെ രാഷ്ട്രീയം എന്നൊരു വിഷയത്തെ അനുകരിച്ച് ഇവിടെ ഒരു വലിയ ആശയം തന്നെ പുറത്തേക്ക് ഇറക്കിയിട്ടിരിക്കുകയാണ്. ഇന്ന് ഈ സെഷൻ്റെ അധ്യക്ഷത പദം അലങ്കരിക്കുന്നത് സഖാവ് KK രാമചന്ദ്രൻ MLA ആണ്. സഖാവിന് സംഘാടക സമിതിക്ക് വേണ്ടിയും എൻ്റെ പേരിലും നന്ദി പറഞ്ഞുകൊള്ളുന്നു. അതുപോലെ മതദേശീയതയുടെ രാഷ്ട്രീയം എന്താണ്, എങ്ങനെയാണ്, എപ്പോഴാണ് എന്നുള്ളൊരു കാര്യത്തെക്കുറിച്ചൊക്കെ വളരെ വിശദമായി നമുക്ക് ഒരു ക്ലാസ് എടുത്ത് തന്ന, നമ്മുടെ കുറേ കാലങ്ങളായിട്ട് നമ്മുടെ ഈ ഒരു സംവാദ പരിപാടിയിൽ നമുക്ക് വേണ്ടി നല്ല ആശയങ്ങളായി വന്ന് സംവദിക്കാറുള്ള ബഹുമാന്യായ പ്രൊഫസർ പ്രഭാത് പട്നായിക്കിനും ഞാൻ സംഘാടക സമിതിക്ക് വേണ്ടിയിട്ടും നമ്മുടെ എല്ലാവരുടെയും പേരിലും നന്ദി പറഞ്ഞുകൊള്ളുന്നു. അതുപോലെ ഈ സെഷന് സ്വാഗതം പറഞ്ഞത് CITU കേന്ദ്ര കമ്മിറ്റി അംഗം സഖാവ് PK ഷാജേട്ടനാണ്. സഖാവിനും സംഘാടക സമിതിക്ക് പേരിലും എൻ്റെ പേരിലും നന്ദി പറഞ്ഞുകൊള്ളുന്നു. അതുപോലെ ഈ സെഷനിൽ പങ്കെടുത്തുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുന്ന എല്ലാ സഖാക്കൾക്കും സുഹൃത്തുക്കൾക്കും നന്ദി പറഞ്ഞുകൊണ്ട് നിർത്തുന്നു.
EMS സ്മൃതി 2026 ദേശീയ സെമിനാർ രാഷ്ട്രീയം, മതം, സംസ്കാരം. ജൂൺ 13 ഒന്നാം ദിനം. ആദ്യത്തെ 2 സെഷനിലൂടെ രാവിലത്തെ സെഷൻ അവസാനിക്കുകയാണ്. എത്തിച്ചേർന്നിട്ടുള്ള മുഴുവൻ സുഹൃത്തുക്കൾക്കും സഖാക്കൾക്കും പുറത്ത് ഉച്ചഭക്ഷണം പ്രത്യേകമായി തയ്യാറാക്കിയ ഹാളിൽ അറേഞ്ച് ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ട്. ഉച്ചഭക്ഷണത്തിന് ശേഷം കൃത്യം 2:15 തന്നെ മൂന്നാമത്തെ സെഷനോടുകൂടി ഉച്ചയ്ക്കൽ സെക്ഷൻ ആരംഭിക്കുകയാണ്. 2 വിഷയങ്ങളാണ് സെഷൻ 3-ൽ അവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്നത്. ആദ്യത്തെ വിഷയം കേരള സമൂഹം, വർഗം, മതം, ജാതി, ഭിന്നമാനങ്ങൾ. വിഷയ അവതരണം നടത്തുന്നത് സാമ്പത്തിക ശാസ്ത്രജ്ഞനും മുൻ കേരള ധനകാര്യ വകുപ്പ് മന്ത്രിയുമായ സഖാവ് ഡോക്ടർ തോമസ് ഐസക്കാണ്. രണ്ടാമത്തെ വിഷയം അസമത്വവും പുറന്തള്ളലും, കേരളത്തിലെ പട്ടികജാതി പട്ടികവർഗ മത്സ്യമേഖലയിലെ ജനങ്ങളുടെ അവസ്ഥ. വിഷയം അവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്നത് കണ്ണൂർ സർവകലാശാല അസിസ്റ്റന്റ് പ്രൊഫസർ ഡോക്ടർ മാളവിക ബിന്നി. ഉച്ചഭക്ഷണത്തിന് ശേഷം കൃത്യം 2:15 തന്നെ മൂന്നാമത്തെ സെഷൻ ഈ വേദിയിൽ ആരംഭിക്കും. 2:15 എല്ലാവരും ഹാളിൽ എത്തിച്ചേരേണ്ടതാണ്.